Welcome, everybody, to the Smooth Brain Society, and Happy New Year! It's not New Year just yet while we record this, but it will be by the time this comes out. So, Happy New Year, everybody. Hope you guys had a fun Christmas, New Year, partying, arguing with family, whatever. All of it, none of it. Um, so this episode, our guest today is Kealagh Robinson. Dr. Kealagh Robinson is a senior lecturer in psychology at Massey University, is also adjunct at Victoria University of Wellington, so works at two universities at the same time. Very fancy. Um, Her research uses experimental, longitudinal, and meta science approaches. Even I don't know what that means, so she will explain to understand emotion regulation, and with a specific emphasis on what factors underpin self-injurious thoughts and behaviors. So great to have you on, Kealagh. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
And as always, you know how the podcast goes. We have a co-host on who has no clue about the topic. But in this case, Kealagh does some very interesting work, which uses a bunch of different research and techniques and topics. And I know a little bit about it, but not a lot. So we decided to get someone who knows a little bit about the other aspects, but not a lot about the aspects which I know on. She's been on before. Now, Dr. Ellie Rukawai, who is now a lecturer at Victoria University of Wellington in psychology, who's, if you guys remember the episode which she's on, is her expertise is in Maori mental health and well-being, and she's also a clinical psychologist. So welcome, Ellie.
Oh, thanks. Not a clin psych yet, but
That's you.
Close
one
enough.
day.
So yeah, thank you. How did you guys spend your New Year's?
In Tauranga, I think.
It's because it hasn't happened yet, not because you don't remember what happened.
Yeah.
Kind of a good
Yeah.
New Year's, right?
Awesome. All right, Kealagh, let's start with a little bit of a background, because I have mentioned that you do use quite interesting techniques to look at sort of look at things in unorthodox ways, I would say. So could you give us a background into your how you got into your field of research and looking at self-injury and emotion regulation through neuroscience techniques?
Yeah, sure. So when I first started at uni, I was really drawn to kind of cognitive science ways of understanding the world. And so when I came to start doing research, I started working in labs in second year. I was doing a lot of kind of memory research, attention kinds of research, and I ended up working with Professor Gina Grimshaw on how we attend to emotional stimuli in our environment using kind of base or bench cognitive psychology techniques like response time and accuracy. And then I got to the end of the honours year, and as anyone who's done honours knows that that's a pretty hectic year, and I needed a bit of a break. And so, very conveniently for me, another research group that I was working for at the time, the lab manager and the postdoc, the postdoc who was the lab manager, had a baby. And so I took over parts of her role while she was on maternity leave, and absolutely fell in love with doing self-injury and suicide research in a community-informed and community-based way. So I had done some bits and bobs of self-injury research in undergrad, mostly because I thought quite arrogantly that I wanted to know why people self-injured, because when I was a young person in school, I had a close friend who self-injured, and I was kind of part of her support network and kind of went along to some of her therapy sessions as well. And at the time, I just remember being so scared and so worried about her, and just feeling like I was like holding a lot of like emotional weight. And so there was this kind of summer scholarship that came across my emails one day looking at how guidance counsellors in New Zealand respond to self-injury in schools using qualitative techniques, which is not something I know anything about. And I thought, oh, I need a job over summer, and I reckon it'd be interesting to figure out why people self-injure. Like, that's like a really interesting question to me, because we have all of these really strongly embedded kind of evolutionary reflexes to protect our body from harm, and then here we have a behavior where people are deliberately overriding those. So naively or arrogantly, I thought I'll spend 10 weeks over summer and I'll figure it out. Jokes on me, that was a decade ago and we still haven't figured it out. So yeah, when I was working with the Youth Wellbeing Study, which is now called the Social Justice and
Social justice and well-being.
Social justice, JAWS, justice and social. Yeah, cut this part.
Jaws like the shark.
Working for the Youth Wellbeing Study, which is head up by Professor Mark Wilson. I fell in love with the topic, and I fell in love with doing research where you could go out to people in the community. You could leave the university and talk to people about what's going on for them. I also had the amazing opportunity, as somebody who's not a clinical psychologist, to attend a clinical training focused on emotion regulation and group therapy that was run by Kim Gratz and Matt Tull, who are amazing emotion researchers, particularly emotion dysregulation and self-injury researchers, who ran a training about their therapy for guidance counsellors in New Zealand. And they started off with they started the training with some emotion psychoeducation around emotion in the body and things like that, which we can get into later. And I just had this like lightning moment of like, oh wow, this is how you do affective science, emotion science, and this is how it actually translates to helping people in the community or on the ground or things like that. So when it came time to do a PhD, I thought, I have this background in experimental methods and affective science in particular. So using these kind of quote unquote bench cognition skills to really kind of tackle to tackle kind of understanding self-injury in a way that we can improve knowledge to be able to help people and better support people who self-injure. So it's a very long-winded kind of explanation, but it does mean that I kind of sit in between these two worlds, kind of sometimes comfortably, sometimes awkwardly, where I have kind of cognitive expertise, and I teach undergrad students cognitive psychology at Massey. So I'm very comfortable in that space. And then I also spend a lot of time working with social psychologists and clinical psychologists and ed psychs primarily out in schools and in universities, but people who spend a lot of time sitting with people who are really struggling at the moment. So that's where I kind of live. So it's really cool to have Ellie on, who I don't think she talked about it in her episode, but a lot of her PhD focused on non-suicidal self-injury, and Zahir as well, who actually taught when he was a first-year student, which makes me feel very old.
Yeah, no, the film was ages ago, because when was that? That was 2014? Should I be saying it?
Yeah.
When you used to teach me?
Yeah, well, I have another old ex-student, I guess, who's now a practicing clinical psychologist, which is a career choice that takes a lot of years to train. And I went to his graduation, and he introduced me to his mum, which was very sweet. So now I teach the first years, so it's a population I care a lot about. So that's quite cool.
That's cute. I think so. Wellington, for those who aren't from there, there's only literally like one sort of area you can go to when you're going out in town at night. And
where is the story going?
And I stopped going. I stopped going out when in PhD I was a tutor, and I was and I was doing what Kealagh used to do, which was like teach first years. And I remember bumping into one of my students going, "Oh, Sahir, what's up?" And I was like, "I'm never going out again. It's done. That's it. This is when you know you're too old."
Well,
Except for Friday, 2 weeks from now. You're definitely coming out then.
Professor Mark Wilson, who has also been on the show, he was one of my PhD supervisors, but he's taught generations of first year students, including me. And he says that from time to time he gets free drinks at restaurants because a lot of first year psychology students work in hospital. That has
Yeah.
yet to happen to me, but I look forward to, if any of my students are listening, please.
No. That did happen to me. It didn't make it any less weird. It did happen to me. I did get a free drink out of it. But no.
Yes.
I haven't had a free drink yet, but I've had multiple students be like, "Hey, Ellie," and I'm like, "Oh, oh no."
Changing boundaries, eh?
Yeah. Actually, I ran into a student at a festival.
Yeah.
He was really sweet. It was like, he was like, "Oh, I'm really like, are you Ellie?" I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "Ellie Rookway." I was like, "Yeah, that's me," thinking it was someone from like high school. He's like, "Oh, you were my lecturer." And I was like,
Oh.
"Oh,
That's
cool."
nice.
But then he was like, no. I'm sorry. I thought about not saying anything because I didn't want to make it awkward, but I just wanted to let you know that I really enjoyed your lectures. I was like, "Oh, bless. Okay, that's
Very
fine."
sweet. Yeah.
So,
Funny.
okay, your lecturers are people too, okay? Your teachers are people too. We have lives.
Especially when we're young.
Yeah, we are young.
Say it enough times, it will come through. um,
Hey, I'm
I,
younger than you both. I am young.
Elliot told me that you can be rangatahi up until like 70. So I'm willing to kind of take that kind of
awesome.
approach. You can be young in some ways and old in others, right?
Okay, after that segue though, back back to Kelly's work. So yeah, you're talking about sort of being in both worlds. I will ask probably a bit more about the world I don't know about. So could you explain NSSI a little bit to me? So non-suicidal self-injury. I know Mark Wilson had touched upon it once upon a time,
Right. Yeah.
but yeah, if you
Yeah.
could
So
talk about it a bit more.
non-suicidal self-injury, or I usually just say NSSI, goes by a bunch of other names. Often people might know it as self-harm. So this is a behavior where people are deliberately injuring their bodies, not because they want to die, but because often they're dealing with really overwhelming or unwanted feelings, and this is a behavior that helps them manage that. So that typically shows up in things like cutting or scratching or banging the body against hard surfaces. So yeah, it's a behaviour that about 18% of the population engage in, which often when I talk to people who aren't in this area, they're surprised by the prevalence of the behaviour. Actually, Mark and I have done some research, and I think he came on the podcast to talk about it with a large community sample of older New Zealand adults, so 18 to 71 plus. And we tend to find about 20% report having ever self-injured in their lifetime. And in combination with some other kind of surveys of community folks, kind of suggests that New Zealand has a little bit higher rates of self-injury compared to places like Australia, but particularly the US. So that's what NSSI is. A lot of my work is focused on self-injury among young people, so adolescents from 13 to 18, out in schools. And when I was over in Western Australia as part of my postdoc, I kind of focused on slightly older adolescents, so emerging adults attending universities. And again, there we see around 20% self-injure, with about 10% in the last year. Yeah.
Big is because the prevalent rate is so high. Are there like many reasons? Not many reasons. Sorry, many behaviors which sort of are associated with it. Because
Yeah.
I feel like when you talk about self injury, generally we think about people cutting themselves. But
Yeah.
I feel like if 20% are doing it, you'd be able to see it, right? more than the number
Yes.
suggests?
So this is an interesting question because we typically measure self-injury focusing on about 13 different most typical behaviors. So those are things like cutting, scratching the skin is the most common. And then there's behaviors such as like breaking bones, which are very uncommon in the population, probably less than 1%. But there's actually an ongoing conversation in the self-injury field at the moment around kind of what are the bounds of self-injury or kind of risky behaviors. So there's this really interesting discussion about whether or not deliberately being injured by other people counts, quote unquote, in our academic definition of NSSI. So this is things like going out deliberately to start fights with a person you know will punch you, for example. I've also heard of, from my clinical colleagues, of folks who are in like martial arts who will change their weight class deliberately for weigh-in and then be kind of underweight when it comes time for the fight, so they're more likely to be injured, or folks who deliberately throw a rugby tackle knowing that they'll kind of get pummeled pretty hard because they have the kind of skills to know what's going to happen in that situation. So it's kind of an ongoing conversation about whether those behaviors which cause injury but are kind of not direct in the same way count as self-injury. More generally in the literature, a lot of the work coming out of the UK doesn't typically distinguish between self-injury behaviors by the intent or what the person intends the behavior to have. So they kind of take a self-harm approach that includes behaviors where the intent for suicide is a little bit more ambiguous or is a direct suicide attempt. So what counts as self-injury is actually quite a contested question in the literature. Yeah.
Yeah. I just want to add to that too, that in my thesis, one of the measures that we use when we ask people about self-injury has like an other box, and then it gets people to write what they did. And a lot of people in mine talked about restrictive eating, like starving themselves or something along those lines, which is really interesting because traditionally that wouldn't have been considered a type of self-harm because it's not like an immediate, it doesn't have an immediate impact on your body. But yeah, so I thought that was really interesting, and that's something that I'm kind of keen on looking at a bit more. But also, there's some really cool stuff about self-injury and how Māori experience it. So Talia Kingi in 2018, I think, she finished her thesis, either 2018, 2019. She interviewed a whole heap of rangatahi about their self-injury, and some of them talked about like getting non-cultural tattoos as being self-harm because their family didn't like give their consent, and it was to harm their wairua, so not their physical being but their like spiritual being. I'm trying to
And
think
to
of what the
harm
other
the whānau connection as well. Hey?
yeah, so like things like that I think add to the complexity of like, well, what is self-harm? And I think I'm very much of the opinion that if the person who's self-harming thinks of it as self-harm, then we treat it as self-harm because people actually know themselves really well.
Well, but I'm a methods nerd, so this is a really tricky, coming from cognitive background, this kind of complexity ties my head in knots. Because the only way we know about somebody's self-injury is if we ask them and they tell us, right? So I agree with Ellie that the language that somebody uses to describe their behavior is the one that we should use. So if you work clinically, for example, and somebody talks about their cutting, then that's the best way to talk about that with a young person, even though that's not necessarily how I would describe it in kind of my academic world. But I've done some research on how we assess self-injury through self-report measures because it's worth kind of explicitly stating that self-injury is a really stigmatized behavior. A lot of people who self-injure are really worried that the folks that are important to them are going to think that they're kind of being attention-seeking or manipulative with their self-injury, and that's why they're self-injuring. And there is research that shows that folks who self-injure have really awful experiences, particularly a lot of this research is based in kind of healthcare settings of emergency departments or nurses or kind of mental health professionals more generally, kind of making really dismissive comments about people's self-injury. So it kind of puts people in this double bind where if they want to reach out and get support, they kind of have to overcome this. They have to find somebody safe that they can disclose to. So all of that kind of stigma is kind of going on in somebody's head or in their psychology when they come to answer my research questions about do you self-injure. And back when we started doing this research in 2012, going out into high school, well, when I came on board in 2012, when we were going out to high schools, one of our requirements of our ethics committee was that we had to ask a screening question about self-injury. So have you ever self-injured, for example, cutting, scratching, banging walls? Because the ethics committee was concerned that if we showed young people a list of self-injury behaviours, that might make them, that might quote unquote plant ideas in their head. So there's kind of iatrogenic risk. That's a very reasonable concern, and this has been really well researched in self-injury, but also in kind of other mental health adjacent areas. And there's absolutely no evidence that asking about self-injury or suicide kind of increases the risk that that person will go on to experience suicidal ideation or to self-injure, things like that. But when you ask people about self-injury, obviously they're coming with all of their pre-existing ideas about what self-injury is, who self-injures. They might have concerns about what we're going to do with that information, if we're going to kind of give them involuntary treatment or kind of tell the school about their self-injury. And so there's some really interesting work that Mark and I did that looked at if you ask people in this kind of have you ever self-injured way versus here's a list of self-injury behaviors, have you ever done this? We actually get quite a lot of discrepancy. So it's about a third of people will say they have engaged in self-injury behaviors, but then they say, no, I've never self-injured. So they don't, and it's tricky to tease that apart. Is that because they're not kind of claiming that self-injury label for themselves? Is that they're concerned about the consequences of disclosing in a research setting? Or is it something completely else? So I think that's a really interesting and tricky research puzzle for us to tease apart around how we ask about self-injury and how we understand self-injury.
Yeah, the self-injury behavior thing is pretty interesting because uh, I can say from my personal experience that if I've gotten mad at someone or something, I've punched a wall. And if you tell me, have you ever done these behaviors, I'd probably tick, yeah, I've definitely punched a wall or two before. But most of the time, it's because I'm being nice to that person who probably deserved to be punched. So, but in in that regard, I, I would probably be someone. If you just purely asked, have you partaken in these behaviors? I
Yeah, and
probably have, but is it
I think
necessarily
that's
the same?
well, that's an open research question, right? And I would say that men are more likely to tick yes to one of the behaviors and then say no to the overall arching question, which maybe is kind of tied to this kind of idea that self-injury is something that young women who are sad do.
Yeah.
And maybe they're not kind of, yeah, like I said, identifying with that label. Yeah.
Yeah,
There was something else I was
I
going to
guess
say.
that was going to be my next question. Are there, I, I feel like men would probably are less likely to say that they self-injure in general, but as far as rates go, is there any real difference in rates between men and women, boys and girls, depending on
Well,
the
the
ages?
biggest gender difference is actually among gender diverse people and trans people. So we see much, much higher rates of self injury and kind of associated mental health challenges among gender diverse, intersex, and trans young people. In terms of young men and young women, young women tend to report slightly higher rates. They tend to start self-injuring a little bit younger. And then, so they might start at, say, 13, whereas like a young boy might start a little bit later, 14, 15. So by the time we get to university, that difference between men and women is much smaller than it is during adolescence. That with a large caveat that, like I've already kind of alluded to, the way that we ask about self-injury
Hmm.
really impacts the rates that we get, and also potentially is the way that we ask the question works differently for men and women. Yeah. But when you were talking about your experience punching walls, I think something that came up for me was that this behavior is really functional. Like people are doing this because it's helping them in that situation. And right at the top of the episode, we talked about how, or I talked about how self injury is often used to kind of deal with overwhelming or unwanted feelings. So that's often things like anger or kind of shame. Ellie can talk a little bit around some of the cool work she's done on whakama among rangatahi who self-injure. But another really kind of common form or function of self-injury is self-punishment. So this idea that I've done something really bad and I deserve to be punished. And so self-injuring helps me kind of meet that goal of self punishment, and then that makes me feel better because I've kind of worked through it. And I kind of see all of the functions of self injury. There's typically we measure about 13 as having as kind of linked around emotions. So, for example, another more kind of social function of NSSI is to kind of demonstrate toughness or show strength to those around you.
Hmm.
And again, like the self punishment, I think there's kind of big feelings going on around there as well. So I like obviously I'm biased because I focus on emotions, but I think there's a lot of emotions around self injury, and this kind of self injuring as a way to kind of reduce the kind of like intensity in your body, or to work through like shame or anger, or to kind of prevent yourself from doing something worse, like hitting somebody or kind of acting on suicidal ideation thoughts. They're all kind of tied up with big feelings as well, which is why I focus on the emotion side of things.
Uh, so should we go there then? So speak about the emotion side of things. Uh, Maybe I should let you take the floor and tell me like what or tell us basically what are the key things which we should probably know or learn, or what you want to talk about with regards to emotion and self harm.
Yeah, so like I was talking about earlier, I come from this kind of tradition of affective science or cognitive science, which sees emotions as this kind of symphony of physiological changes. So changes in your heart rate and your how sweaty your skin is, if you're blushing, for example, as well as the kind of subjective feelings. So we talk about feeling happy or feeling nostalgic or feeling embarrassed. So we have these kind of generally kind of positive feelings and generally negative feelings. There's no kind of moral lens on that. That's just kind of how they feel. And then we have emotional behavior as well. So if you think about someone who's really angry, they might cross their arms. Their eyes might like close a little. They might lean back in their seat. So we have emotion across these kind of three different domains, and we are attending to something in the environment, whether that's our external environment. So we might see our beloved cat sitting on the couch, or it might be something in our internal environments. We might be reminded of like a person who's very dear to us, and then that stimulus gets appraised in light of our like goals and our previous experiences. And then that gets tagged as a value. So if it's in the, your beloved cat, for example, you might feel really like warm and, that kind of love feeling. You might smile. Your pupils will dilate if you're looking at something that you have a really strong positive label to. So we have this kind of often we're mostly aware of the kind of subjective feelings. So I feel good, I feel bad, I feel angry, I feel joyful, but kind of going on under the hood, as it were, is all these kinds of behaviors and physiology as well. And that's because emotions are really functional. They're kind of evolutionarily evolved phenomena that help prepare us and our bodies to respond to our environment. So, for example, being frightened and our heart rate accelerating, and our muscles kind of getting ready to run helps us, run from the threats in our environment. And over time, that has become kind of largely focused on social threats because that's a really important part of our psychology. Yeah, so I come from this kind of tradition that sees emotion in quite a nuanced way. And in the self-injury world, emotion, the kind of tradition is much more clinically based. And so while the affective science side sees emotion as these kind of like a broader puzzle with lots of important pieces linking together, in the clinical domain, they take a much broader, more holistic approach to emotion. And typically that's called emotion dysregulation, which I wanted to kind of call out to some amazing work that's been done here in Aotearoa. So we actually have as of this year, we have a te reo Māori word for emotion dysregulation, which is kare a roto ko titi. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about the etymology of the word because I think it describes the phenomena really well. So kare a roto is used to describe emotions and feelings or kind of internal states. And ko titi is one of the te reo Māori words for the rifleman or the smallest bird in Aotearoa, which flies very short distances very quickly. And I'm a massive bird nerd, so I can tell you that the average kind of weight of a ko titi is around 6 grams. So they get buffeted about in the wind a lot because they're just so small. So this idea kind of being like, buffeted about, or this kind of, quick, short distance metaphor is a really apt one for describing someone's kind of emotional experience. So clinical psychology tends to focus on this kind of holistic pattern of kind of emotional functioning, and then affective science comes at it from a very like zoomed in what's your body physically doing in this environment? Is your heart rate elevated? Are your palms sweaty? So that's kind of my general approach to emotion, is trying to marry those two things together. Yeah, so a lot of the NSSI work has looked at emotion dysregulation. So we know that people who self-injure report much greater challenges managing their emotions. And I'm talking like a co-INSD of like 1.2, so substantially higher, really meaningful differences in kind of these emotion dysregulation self-report measures. And so when I was reading the literature, emotions seem to come up again and again in self-injury worlds. And when you ask people about their self-injury, they often talk about the big feelings that are kind of going along with their self-injury, or that their self-injury is helping to manage. And then coming in with my affective science background, I was like, oh, well, we know a lot at this kind of zoomed out level, kind of what's going on in the body, what's happening in that kind of minutia of an emotion unfolding. So that's kind of where I got to my PhD, was this kind of, trying to marry these two worlds together, these two different literature bases. Sorry, I just keep rambling. Clearly, I told Ellie this morning that I had to reread this paper, and I was like, "Oh yeah, let me remember what I did for my PhD." But clearly, it's all still in there.
Yeah. No, there's a lot in there, but the idea of marrying the emotion dysregulation with the cognitive side of emotion, which we sort of think of as purely physiological and behavior and that feeling. How hard is it actually to do, considering you've been doing it for what, 8, 10 years now?
It's very fun and challenging. So Sahir asked me on to talk about a specific paper, which was published earlier this year. And the background to that was I started piloting that experiment as part of my master's in 2016. So that kind of gives you an indication of some of the difficulties in this area. I have been really lucky to kind of work across different kind of conceptualizations. Like I said, I'm not a clinical psychologist, but I have a number of really fantastic clinical colleagues who are very generous with their with sharing their knowledge and kind of talking about their clients' experiences with me. And equally, I have a number of really excellent kind of affective science colleagues who, when I say kind of some of the assumptions that underlies my work, are like, oh, but wait, how does that work? So, for example, when I present about self-injury and kind of more cognitive spaces, one of the questions I always used to get was, well, how could hurting yourself possibly make you feel better, right? Like it seems so counterintuitive. And so here you might know this, but there's this kind of operant conditioning process where if you take away something bad, you feel better. So in this instance, and then that gets reinforced over time. So you're more likely to engage in that behavior in the future. So here people are tapping into a kind of an embedded basic part of psychology where removing something bad actually helps you feel better in the moment. And we kind of see this in lots of animals, including non-human animals. So there's this argument that we can study some of the kind of more genetic contributions or the epigenetic contributions to self-injury by looking at things like over-grooming in rats and macaques. Yeah. So,
Yeah, yeah, I know about the over grooming
yeah,
one with
yeah.
rats. Um, so, but then so that's one thing of yeah, like you said, cognitive people. And my first question was also going to be something like, how does this actually help you feel better, or how does harming yourself technically help you feel more in control? But then, how would you how would you measure what's happening in terms of the cognitive? Because when you think about cognitive research, you're getting people in a lab and sort of
Yeah.
strapping them up to heart rate, brain
Yeah.
scans, whatever. And you in that situation, how are you going to measure something or assess something which is someone trying to feel better and therefore harming themselves? How were you able to sort of marry that?
Yeah, so I would say that my research kind of looks at emotional functioning among people who self-injure, rather than necessarily kind of the emotions that precipitate or are antecedents to an instance of self-injury. Like you kind of mentioned, the kind of pragmatic constraints of working with people who are just about to self-injure or who are self-injuring currently are really, really tricky. And there's kind of a big ethical question around what you would do as a researcher in that kind of space. So I've done a little bit of research using kind of ecological momentary assessment techniques where you send people like a text message at different times throughout the day, kind of asking what's going on for them. Have they self-injured, things like that. And there's some really exciting kind of developments in psychophysiology tools that are kind of in progress at the moment. So if you, for example, were in one of my colleagues' studies, you might be wearing like a smartwatch that has a heart rate monitor in it, and then also kind of measuring or also responding to these self-report prompts about whether or not you have self-injured, what's going on, how are you feeling, what's happening in your environment. And I think there's some really interesting and cool statistical models that can be built using that. But that is a really new area of technological development, actually. And so we're beginning to see some of the first kind of pieces of evidence out of those studies. But I was more interested in what is the kind of general emotional functioning of people who self-injure. So across all of our theories of self-injury, there's this idea that because people are relying on self-injury as kind of one tool to help them manage overwhelming emotions, perhaps their emotions are more intense or they come on more strongly than others, or maybe they have developed less effective kind of immediate ways to help them manage those big emotions. So I'm talking about things like cognitive reappraisal, kind of changing the way that you think about the situation to change your emotional experience. So that's often like seeing the silver lining. So baked into kind of all of our theories is this kind of underlying assumption that there's something different happening in the kind of emotional process of people who self-injure. And so I was really interested in kind of looking at that idea from a PhD because, like I mentioned earlier, emotions are composed of lots of different domains. So you have the behavior, you have the physiology, and you have the subjective feeling. So one of the ideas I was trying to tackle was, is there something kind of at a physiological level where people who self-injure, their emotions are generated in their body more intensely. So maybe their body is more responsive to things going on in their environment, for example, than their peers. Or is it kind of happening more at the subjective level? So their kind of physiological responses kind of similar to people who don't self-injure, but the way that they're interpreting them is a little bit different, or they're interpreting them as more intense or less tolerable, or things like that. So you're right; it's quite tricky. So I spent most of the years of my PhD bringing volunteers and participants into one of the cognitive behavioural testing labs here at Vic, and wiring them up with lots of electrodes, and then creating an emotional challenge for them. So again, using the kind of more experimental, well, it was an experiment, using some of those affective science techniques where you create an emotional challenge, so you have more experimental control over a person's experience. So what I did was I used a component of a very well established stress induction, the Trio social stress test, which asks the part that I used asked participants to count backwards in intervals of 17 from 2020. And while you were doing that, I had I had 9 lovely Confederates. So a person wearing a white lab coat with a clipboard telling you to go faster, and giving you a very stern, assertive look because they're, I've told you that they're measuring your working memory and your intelligence. So as you can imagine, a pop math test is quite stressful, and in fact, the part that kind of carries the most stress is this kind of social element where you're struggling, and somebody's giving you very little, positive feedback. So they're not nodding, they're not, going or anything like that, which is really hard to do. I had participants like making jokes and just, like really counting on their fingers and becoming quite stressed. And my lovely, lovely Confederates had to sit there with this kind of poker face on and not kind of jump in and like this is very like, natural response to be like, it's okay. This is designed to be hard. So I created emotional challenge, and that works really well. That test is used around the world. It's like the gold standard for creating stress in the laboratory. And so I measured how people felt before, during the stress, and then I got them to rest for 5 minutes afterwards as well. So I asked them how they were feeling, and I was measuring their heart rate, and also how sweaty the palms of their hands were, so the electrodermal response as well. So that was a large amount of my life, kind of running participants individually through the session, and obviously doing that in a ethical way is really important to me. And so the test itself, the experiment itself took about 40 minutes when you had all the questionnaires and the stressor and the debriefing and things like that. But I would actually book out an hour and a half because I had some really amazing conversations with young people as part of the debriefing process where we talked about, okay, well, first, the math test isn't real. It's not a measure of intelligence. It's just a way that we create stress. Thank you so much. This is why we create stress in the lab. This is why we can't do it any kind of other way. And then talking a little bit about self-injury and other ways that young people manage stress, particularly in university environments. And I had some really excellent conversations with young people. I showed them around the cognitive and the neuroscience labs up here, showed them the EEG chamber. And I think, I get really excited about methods and talking to young people and students about how these kind of cognitive science approaches can tell us things that we can then apply down the line to help people out. Yeah. So it was a large amount of my work life for many, many years. And I would say that as stressful as it was for my participants by design, and I'm very grateful for them, it was also very, very stressful for me because I would be waiting outside the door for the 5 minutes while my confederate was stressing my participant, being like, how is it going? Are they doing okay? Is everything fine? Because obviously participants have the right to withdraw their consent at any time. And that is something that I was really careful to highlight for them in the informed consent process, but also at each stage of the experiment, I asked them if they were willing to continue. And I had a few participants who were like, I'd like to stop now, which is amazing. And we would talk about, we kind of did the whole debriefing process there and have a conversation. But I also had participants who asked to stop during the stress induction, which I think is amazing because there's this real power differential between a participant and the experimenter. And to say, hey, I'd like to stop, to an experimenter who's, being quite stern or like poker faced to you is a really impressive thing to do. So I was always kind of lurking awkwardly in the corridor, being like, how's things going? And then it's also hard to stress someone. Like it's a stressful thing for my confederate. So it was a lot of kind of checking in with them and seeing how that goes. But yeah, that's why they gave me a PhD, because it was quite hard. So a little bit different from a lot of the community stuff that I was doing, in that like folks were coming into the university and that was kind of, they had to come in because the tech was based up here. It's not super mobile.
Uh, oh, yeah. First, who were your confederates? How do you get, was it 5 people, 9 people to...
I had 9 people, and I deliberately, because I recruited young women as a kind of way to, again, increase the experimental control of the study, because we know that young men and young women kind of respond to emotional challenge slightly differently. And there's kind of this evidence that maybe their self-injury shows up in slightly different ways as well. So to kind of highlight the kind of power differential that I think is important for the stress, I recruited every single man in psychology that I had any kind of relationship with. So I had some really lovely friends and colleagues in the lab, including Dr. Chris Mayman, who was recently on the podcast. He was one of my confederates. He was very good. They were all excellent. But what was really funny was I asked my lab at the time, I did a little fun survey to ask, who do you think is the most effective at stressing people? Because I have the data, right? I can tell. And I would say I had to massively hack my way, but the lab manager at the time was considered to be the most scary, but he actually wasn't. So I thought that was a really funny, he's a close friend of mine, to say that everyone in our lab is afraid of you. But actually the participants, you weren't that scary.
I guess the other thing, because you did mention the ethics of it, how do you get people to sort of be part of the study? Because I assume you still need to tell them at the beginning that it's a study related to self-harm in some way, shape, or form. So then recruiting someone who, I guess, shows higher rates or higher levels. self harm would be
Yeah,
harder?
so for my for the study that we're talking about, I recruited 50% of the sample had a past year history of self injury, and 50% had never self injured in their lifetime. And again, I was quite drawing from my affective science background. I was a little bit worried about telling people that I had recruited them to this study based on their self injury history, because we know that people who self injure report much higher kind of emotion dysregulation. So I thought kind of priming that or making that very obvious before I kind of very obviously create an emotional challenge would kind of impact the results and impact the results differently for people who self injure versus the control group. So what we did was we had our self-injury survey measures embedded into part of the kind of mass testing that all first-year students are invited in psychology and are invited to take part in. So if they consented to, they were asked questions about their self-injury, behaviours, why they self-injure, when they started self-injuring, things like that. And at the end of that section, we asked them, would you be interested in being invited to take part in other self-injury research? So what I did was I then took all the people who said yes, they're willing to take part in self-injury research, and I advertised my study to them. So I told them on the consent form that they're going to take part in an arithmetic challenge, that there's going to be these kind of physiology recordings. Given that we're in Aotearoa, New Zealand, I told them, your head isn't going to be touched. I kind of explained how we put on the electrodes. And yeah, that informed consent process was very important to me because it was a stress induction or an emotional challenge, but also because of the self injury angle. So I would send people the consent form 24 hours ahead of time via email, chat with them for about 10 minutes beforehand. So I did have to have this kind of element of deception where I didn't tell them during, like right before the experiment started, that it was about self injury. But I kind of told them all the bits that I could. And then during the debriefing, we'd really talk about, we'd get rid of that. Well, I'd explain that deception and I'd explain why it was important and things like that. Yeah. And again, that kind of emphasizing that participants can withdraw at any time. They still will get their credit. It doesn't impact, like it's not a problem for my research or things like that. Really emphasizing that that's their right, and I really welcome that if that's where they're at. Yeah.
I guess it's also the thing in the screening process. You had mentioned at the start that some people would be nervous with what you do with the information, what you do with the data.
Yeah,
If
absolutely. Yeah.
and do you feel as a researcher, if you see someone, if you come across a screening case where you think they probably should get help with it, you need help, how does it go then? Well, what goes through your mind with anything else?
Yeah, yeah. So we know that from kind of the scientific evidence that people who self-injure are usually self-injuring because there's lots of other challenges going on in their life. So people who self-injure report much greater anxiety, depression, challenges with kind of social relationships. And we also know that people who self-injure are at elevated risk of future suicidal ideation and suicide behavior. But what we don't know is at what point self-injury might be kind of clinically meaningful. And that's a bit of a kind of, again, an ongoing conversation. Self-injury is included in the DSM-5 as a condition requiring further study. So this is kind of an active area of clinical research. So I was really mindful that that if I was going to break confidentiality, which is, sometimes a thing that needs to happen because you're worried about somebody's safety, that I would only do so in an instance where the information that I was receiving from the participant was kind of to a significant extent where it was meaningful clinically. And I relied a lot on my amazing clinical collaborators in that regard because that's outside of my expertise. So I didn't actually, for this study, I didn't pass on anyone to any kind of clinical support. And I think that's actually really important because people are signing up for a research study. They're not signing up for therapy or intervention. And I'm also not qualified to provide those things. So, we talked a lot in the debriefing about kind of managing challenges and managing stress and kind of ways that are kind of aligned with our values and where we're going, and ways that would kind of take us away from the person we want to be. And all of my participants, as first year university students, were navigating challenges. So every single student received a list of resources that are available to them in the community, and we could talk about if a person asked more about a specific resource. I was very happy to talk about that. But that was also one of the things that I was mindful of with working with my confederates, because most of my confederates were in kind of cognitive psychology spaces, and so this was the kind of first time they were really thinking about self-injury and how that might show up for people. So kind of sitting with them and debriefing afterwards, particularly if somebody had kind of like visible scarring or things like that, just kind of managing the distress that can create for experimenters, researchers. Yeah.
So, so shall we move on to what you found then? If
Yeah.
you put these
I
poor
mean,
people, you made them do a math test, which is stressful at the best of times, but they came to you voluntarily and you put them through that. You
yeah.
you plugged all sorts of things to them to measure their heart rates and all. You bullied your friends into being Confederates. Um, and after all that, yeah, let's talk about what you found and what does it mean.
Yeah, well, this is a very short answer. I found not much. Um, so I found that the participants who self-injured reported much higher difficulties managing their emotions than the control group. I found my math test was stressful, great, and I found that
Didn't need much for
my
that.
no, that was pretty well established. And that 5 minute resting period afterwards kind of helped people kind of reduce their emotions as well. So their heart rate decelerated, their palms got less sweaty, and they kind of reported less negative mood. I also found that the self-injury group came into my study reporting a little bit higher negative mood than the control group, which makes sense if you think about the fact that people who self-injure are often navigating lots of other challenges, right? So they might also be experiencing. I found that my NSSI group would report more mental health diagnoses than my control group, which is again consistent with the literature. What I didn't find is any kind of meaningful difference between my self-injury group and my control group in how they responded to the emotional challenge. So they felt the kind of change in their negative mood was very similar, how their heart rate changed was very similar, and how their subjective response changed as well, very like not meaningfully different from each other. So that's kind of showing us that there's not anything different happening in the autonomic nervous system of how people are responding to emotional challenge, or at that kind of subjective level of how they're interpreting it. I also asked people about two different kind of common emotion regulation strategies. So cognitive reappraisal, that kind of seeing the silver lining that I talked about earlier, and suppression, which is kind of trying to not show an emotion response, kind of lock it down. I found no difference in the strategies people used. I also followed up with a subset of the sample 2 weeks later about how they remembered feeling during the task. What I thought was quite funny is they remembered feeling more negative mood 2 weeks later than they reported at the time. So it kind of got worse in memory. And I think that's possibly because in that debriefing process, I talked about how the study was designed to be stressful and things like that. But again, I found no difference between the NSSI group and the control group and how that kind of emotional memory unfolded. So what does that mean exactly? It means that there's kind of this dissociation or difference between how people feel their emotion, how people evaluate their emotional functioning, and how they actually responded to a specific emotional challenge in a very controlled environment. And as with all kind of cognitive experimental research, the question is, okay, well, how ecologically valid is that? I created an emotional challenge in a very controlled situation. I made it really clear to participants that they could choose to quit at any time. They knew they were in a study that's quite different from, a fight with your romantic partner, for example. So what I've done since then is trying to kind of cross off lots of other different emotional challenges to see if it's, the stress induction that I use as the gold standard. It's a very effective tool, but it's not specific to that person, right? So one of my amazing PhD students, Hannah Pizey at Curtin University in Western Australia, has done a similar experiment just looking at negative mood and asking people to recall a negative event that happened to them. So a highly personal event. And I've had another excellent honours student who's been doing a content analysis of those kind of open text responses. And so folks are talking about really, a wide range of things. So they're talking about interpersonal conflict at work. They're talking about death of a loved one. They're talking about, financial challenges, interactions with police, things like that. And again, we find that the emotional challenge, made people increase their negative mood, and that the NSSI group reported greater negative mood in general, but there's no difference in how they were responding to that task. So again, kind of showing that even in a really highly personalized emotional challenge, there's not a difference in kind of how the emotional process unfolds in a specific emotional instance. Which isn't to say that we should completely ignore the emotion dysregulation findings, because those are really robust, and we know that poor emotion dysregulation predicts the onset of NSSI over time. That was some of my master's research out in schools, tracking kids from year 9 to year 11. So kids who say it's hard for them to manage their emotions are at elevated risk of self-injuring a year later. And interestingly, it also goes back the other way. So if you self-injure a year later, you're more likely to say it's more difficult for you to manage your emotions, maybe because there's this kind of narrowing of regulation tools that you're kind of developing. And we know that some of our best therapies for NSSI are working because they're reducing emotion dysregulation. So there's something really important about what people think about their emotions, but that's quite different from how they're actually emotionally responding in a specific emotional instance.
Wow. I think I missed it. Um, or maybe you could clarify. They clearly did not have they showed the same physiological responses. Was that including like it didn't take them sort of longer to come back to normal, like to
Yep.
like normal or
So
whatever in that sort of
Yep, so
way?
their heart rate went up the same amount from baseline. They recovered to the same extent.
Because
It took
when
them
because I
as long
think
to recover.
Because I think we associate sometimes like that heart rate variability and all with ability to regulate emotions, right? As well.
Yeah.
Oh,
So I
so
looked at heart rate as like an overall measure, so in terms of beats per minute. And I also looked at heart rate variability, which is a really interesting physiological measure that talks about how variable the time between your heartbeats is. And that is a measure of kind of top-down control of your autonomic nervous system. So this is both a state measure, so our heart rate variability decreases under emotional challenge, but it's also thought to be a state measure. So if you're someone with greater variability, you're more able to respond faster in your environment, which is thought to be a component of better emotion regulation capacity. So interesting. There is some research that shows that people who self-injure have lower trait level heart rate variability. That's a little bit murky sometimes. There's not a lot of physiology research in self-injury. I found no difference in my NSSI group and my control group. and I found no difference in how they responded over the course of the experiment as well. So in across kind of 3 different measures of physiology or how the body is responding across different domains of the autonomic system, found no difference. So this was kind of the call of my PhD. It was like, is there a difference? No. And that's really interesting because
It
the theory
genuinely
suggests
is.
that they should be.
Yeah. No, it tells us something still. So
So,
So
I'm
I
really
find it
interested
reassuring to
to
tell my PhD students, even if you find nothing, they still give you a PhD. As long as you ask and address an interesting question
yeah.
and you do it properly.
but I think that's a very interesting outcome, right? Because then it's not those, but there must still be something in there because people are reporting
Yeah.
differences, and therefore maybe
And those
you need to put
reports
them.
are meaningful,
Yeah,
you
so
know?
you might need to put them under like a brain scan and see, and other things, see where the difference lies, because it must be somewhere.
Well,
Or
so Ellie and I have recently received funding to kind of explore this further. So, what we're going to do is look at what people believe about their emotions, because I think that's a really interesting kind of area to take this. So, we see that people are saying that their emotions are much more difficult to manage in this kind of holistic sense. But really, they're remarkably resilient and responding to instances of emotional challenge as well as their peers, right? So I think there's something going on with how we're evaluating our emotions. So the extent to which we think our emotions are controllable or useful or useless is thought to relate to how dysregulated we say we are. And so Ellie and I are going to go out to schools. It's a bit of a returning to my research roots, which is great, and work with young people and a member of their whānau and do a longitudinal study of how young people and their family member experience emotions, what beliefs they hold about their emotions, their emotion dysregulation, and their self injury. So we can look at how emotional beliefs might turn into emotion dysregulation for young people, and if that process unfolds differently in families where kids self injure. So that's we're going to start that next year. I'm so excited.
yeah, for context for people, Kayla and Ellie just won this massive grant called the Marsden Grant. Uh,
Marsden Fast Start.
sorry, Marsden what?
Fast
Marsden
start.
Fast Start.
Faster. But
Yeah, which is for early career researchers in New Zealand.
but for context for people who are not in New Zealand or necessarily do academic research, academics try to like attack each other as much as they can over such grants. It kind it's
I think
it,
there was a 12% success rate this year. Yeah, so it's very competitive, and there's lots of different phases of writing and trying to convince people that your research is interesting and well conducted and gets reviewed by international experts, and it's all a little bit overwhelming. And then you kind of find out it's also hard because New Zealand is really small community, and everyone kind of finds out around the same time. So while you're celebrating, other friends are not. I was actually on 2 grants this year. I was very happy to get this one, but I was also really sad to not get the other one. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. Yeah.
and
And it
based on
takes like
your
a year
Yeah, it takes a
from
really long
applying to
time,
like
right?
finding out
So I'm thrilled to not have to write another grant application next year as well
for a few years.
for a few years.
but based on your reporting, if you got rejected from the grant, if you're someone who is part of your NSSI group, you would report greater emotional dysregulation, but the physiological effect of getting a rejection letter would be the same.
Exactly the same. Yep, exactly.
There you go.
Fascinating.
I
So
learned
Crazy.
interesting.
I learned something. Real world applications here.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of real world application, when I go out to schools and I talk to whānau or talk to clinicians, I think the applications of this research is that young people who self injure are experiencing their emotions as really challenging. At the same time, there's likely instances where they've done really amazing emotion regulation and they've kind of responded in a very kind of typical way that anyone in that situation would respond, right? So we know that people who self-injure are more likely to experience life challenges. They're more likely to have kind of interpersonal conflict, more likely to feel disconnected from their school, things like that. They're more likely to have, like objectively challenging things happen in their life. They're more likely to experience bullying. And so maybe one of the things that's going on to that kind of evaluation of how they're doing is that they're just kind of dealing with more shit than everyone else. So I think therapeutically, kind of highlighting instances where people have done really great emotion regulation and kind of upping that kind of self-efficacy beliefs is possibly the way to go. And also, I find it when I talk to particularly family of young people who self-injure, this kind of idea that NSSI is functional and it's helping people manage big feelings is actually a really great way to kind of bust some of that stigma, or that kind of, and explain why people might be engaging this behavior that often, older generations have never heard of before, although it was definitely happening, and kind of develop some of that kind of empathy and understanding. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, the old generations thing is funny because they always say things being like, "Oh, this didn't used to be there at the time." No, you kind of just ignored it, didn't you?
Well, there's descriptions of self-injury in the Bible. Yeah. And
Yeah.
there's Ellie is probably the better person to kind of talk to about this, but within Wellington, there's an area of the landscape called Red Rocks and the rocks are red because of like a myth around self-injury, or about self-injuring as a way to cope with emotional distress. So
Yeah.
this is part of our,
Yeah.
fucked up, really.
Yeah. So for Māori, there was and probably still is a practice called kiri hai hai, which literally translates to lacerate the skin. And that was done under like extreme distress, at the loss of like a loved one or something. But it wasn't necessarily encouraged, but it also wasn't looked down upon because the scars were seen as like a reminder of that person and who they were. And it was just an extreme expression of grief, and emotion at the loss of that person. And there's artwork that depicts it. You see it talked about in like waiata or motiatia, pūrākau, so stories. And like self-harm's I don't want to say normal, but it comes up in a lot of.
It's been with us for a long time.
Yeah.
This is not just
it's not just
young people
contained.
these days kind of
Yeah,
thing.
you guys saying this actually reminded me that there is something very similar in Shia Islam where the where the certain times of year where you sort of blade yourself on the chest and back to try to based on a story which if I get into it's long, but it's the point of self-injury being part of it. Similar, I've seen similar sort of practices in Hinduism as well, but not my
And
religion,
it's
so I can't
interesting.
claim further. But I've seen, like that. I can see
Yeah.
this sort of practice. Maybe I'll get Pharaoh back on and she can explain.
Yeah.
But yeah,
And it's interesting. We were talking right at the top of the episode around definitions, but again, there's a big conversation about how these kind of culturally embedded practices, if they count as self-injury or not, and what we can learn from these kind of cultural practices, and what we can bring from particularly some of the biological kind of knowledge of self-injury, how we can marry those together to better understand what's happening.
yeah, because not at the beginning, you also, not just the beginning, throughout, you said that this self injury is sort of used as a way to uh, sort of feel like control, as a sense of like a feeling of control. And therefore, when you're talking about treatment or sort of treatment practices which are done to sort of reduce self harm, self injury, you, I feel Ellie could probably answer this better as someone who works, who does clinical work. Is that sort of like how do you go about sort of training someone out of it? Because I think in a way it sort of links back to how I think of rituals, right? Like sort of ritualistic practices are done to reduce anxiety, reduce sort of stress, even just like sort of things which you do before a sports game to make you feel comfortable.
There's
It's
some really interesting work done by Dr. Sophie Hayward where she interviewed people who self-injure, and one of her participants said that they would start every day by self-injuring kind of preemptively as a way to kind of make it through the day. And that reminds me again of what you're saying around rituals and kind of, yeah, getting yourself prepared to go through like a big challenge. But Ellie works with people therapeutically, so I'll leave her to answer this question.
Not yet. I haven't yet, but next year probably. I guess it's kind of, I think it's a bit mixed at the moment in how, like, what is the gold standard of working with young people who self-injure, and because there's the whole like, oh, rubber band and around your wrist and snap it, but that is just another form of self-harm, really.
Yeah, and there's work that says that people who self-injure find that really invalidating.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Exactly.
yeah.
Or like, I've heard of, I don't know if this is like TikTok knowledge or not, but I'm pretty sure I've seen people have been told to like, oh, put your hand in an ice bath or like things like that. And again, I can imagine that that's really invalidating for people. And they also like, if water's really, really cold, probably still a form of self-harm of some
if you leave your
kind.
hand for long enough,
Yeah.
you will get
So
tissue damage.
you can't just replace one form of self-harm with another. That's not gonna work. So I think, yeah, a lot of what we focus on is the emotion dysregulation side, and teaching strategies around emotion regulation. And I had something that's gone. It's left my head.
So the kind of gold standard at the moment is dialectical behavior therapy for adolescents or for adults, and there's some really interesting work around kind of embedding those skills more generally in schools and stuff. And I will provide here so with some resources if you're listening to this and you're like, oh, I'd love to know kind of some resources for where to go for support, or just to kind of have in my back pocket if I come across this in my life. I'll link to some excellent work that's done by an organization called SIOS, which is run by researchers and people with lived experience of self-injury around sharing their stories of recovery and what helps them. I would say possibly controversially, but we know that self-injury is functional and is helping people. And for some people, self-injury is a way that they can work through intense feelings of suicidal ideation. And in that instance, from a kind of pragmatic perspective, I think taking away something that helps someone kind of manage is probably unhelpful in the long term. And again, it's kind of supporting people while they're self-injuring, because a lot of people don't want to stop self-injuring, right? And so kind of working around what's going on, that's kind of creating the context for self-injury. And then if somebody would like to stop, or would like to kind of start that recovery process, kind of supporting them to do that as well. Again, I'm a big fan of kind of autonomy and using particularly lived experience perspectives kind of inform how we understand self-injury, and particularly work with people who self-injure.
Yeah, I think too, like making sure that people are looking after their wounds, is part, like properly looking after them as part of working with people who don't necessarily want to stop self-harming at the time. And I think, Taylor, you just said something that reminded me too, like about working with the context as well. Sometimes we can't change, well, a lot of the time we can't change the context, right? So the first thing that pops into my head is, well, you know, a lot of our minority groups might self-harm because of the racism, the discrimination, colonization, intergenerational trauma. You're one person. How are you supposed to fix that? Like, you can't fix these things that are institutionalized.
You change your voting patterns.
I mean, yeah.
Become an activist, right? I feel like a lot of people who work in mental health are also activists. But yeah, I mean,
Absolutely.
you
Like,
do what you can, right?
yeah, you're working within these constraints, and as much as I would love to be like, fix colonization,
Yeah.
rewind, or we'll just make people not discriminatory or racist anymore, that's like not something that you can just change like that. It is something that takes time, and so yeah, you have to work with the person with where they're at, and also with where society is at, and working around developing coping strategies for when they encounter racism, discrimination, those kinds of things that provide them with an alternative coping strategy to self harm. Yeah.
And I mean, DBT, one of the core goals is to build a life worth living, right? So it's that really holistic, big picture.
Yeah. Uh, yeah, I don't have much else to add to that, really, because
Right, because I think I'm like supervision with Teresa.
oh, awesome. So just to finish off then, because we've been recording for a while, and yeah, I guess I could ask a lot more questions, but I think it's good to end here. And Ellie gave snippets for when we can get her back on to talk about all of her work and maybe a little bit more
Yeah.
about the project later. Kayla, final question then for you. If you had one piece of advice to give all our listeners, what would it be
About self-injury or about life?
about life?
About life. Oh,
Easy
I'm
question.
going to answer about self-injury while I think about my advice for life. In terms of self-injury, I think if you're somebody who self-injures, know that you are not alone. There's a lot of people who self-injure. This is a perfectly understandable behavior. This is not something that is unique. There's a lot of people who are also kind of going through life using self-injury as a way to cope. If you're somebody who is supporting somebody, a loved one who self-injures, again, I would say you are in a group of people who are also trying that, doing their best to look after people and support people who self-injure. And there's a lot of really great resources for how to sit in that quite difficult stage of life. And again, I'll pass those along to Sahir so you can link them at the bottom of the podcast. In terms of life, I mean, let's say, well, I'll be very cheesy. A lot about life is the connections that we make along the way, right? So Ellie and I probably has come through quite clearly. We know each other quite well. Ellie and I did PhDs in the same lab, and particularly in science, but I think in life in general, the community you have around you is what matters, and kind of making the time to prioritize that is important as well, which is also such a psychology answer. So there you go.
It is, but it's a really good answer. So, thank you so much, Kaylee. Thank you so much, Ellie, for joining. Thank you, everybody who listened, who's listening, who got to the end. Uh, um, yeah. Now I need to. It's a new year, so I need to start plugging things again. So follow us on Instagram, on Facebook, on all at the Smooth Brain Society, on YouTube. Sign up to our Patreon. We've got a Patreon now. We have a patron. It's a new year. Make a resolution. Pay $3 a month, whatever it is. It could be going to a gym, but instead go give it to us. Be die happy and knowledgeable at a young age because you weren't fit. It's fine. No, thank you so much. Like, follow, subscribe, all those things, and see you in the next episode. Take care.